Good evening, ghouls, and today we have another reading. And I promised yesterday that we're going to be continuing with dreams, because that's what the lecture's on this week. But instead of reading a short story, I'm going to be reading some extracts. I'm also going to be going to a text which does something a bit different with the dream. So last night in the tale that we read, there was this sort of sense of fantastic indecision. Was the dream real or was it fake? Was it demonic? Was it the production of an ill mind? And what we have in today's reading is very clearly a demonic dream. A conception of sleep and the dream space as a space which is particularly open to demonic attack and demonic influence. There's a whole debate through sort of the early modern period into the 18th century about sort of dream sin, as it were, and whether you can sin in dreams, whether you can be led into sin in dreams. And what you find in quite a few Gothic texts is a connection of dreams with temptation, and this sort of sense that the journey downwards starts with a dream. You certainly see that in the novel that I'm going to be talking about today, which is Zofloya by Charlotte Dacre. And I've mentioned this a lot of times in the classes. The basic story is about Victoria Loredani, who is a sort of monstrous heroine, ends up sort of cutting a swath through her acquaintance of murder and lust, etc. The bit that you need to be aware of now is that she's married to a chap called Berenza, who has a brother called Henrique, who has a fiancée called Lila. Now, she is enamored of Henriques and wishes to be his, or wishes him to be hers. And it's almost sending her out of her mind, this longing and this passion and this desire. And she hates Berenza. She wants him to die. She blames him for seducing her. And also she wishes Lila to die, the sort of the angelic heroine who Enrique has always loved, despite the fact that she's only like 15 now, which is super creepy. But the bit that I'm going to read to you today is a series of dreams that she has. And it's not her fall into sin per se, but it's certainly a turning point in her journey. And it's what brings the demonic into her life. So I'm going to read these parts with you. And then at the end, I'm going to go back and point out the demonic elements, how we can understand these as demonic dreams. So we're told that at length she fell into a disturbed slumber. Dreams of mysterious tendency began to flit in the disordered eye of sleep. First, she beheld in a beautiful and luxurious garden Lila and Enriquez. His arm encircled her waist and her head reclined upon his shoulder, while he contemplated her angelic countenance with looks of ineffable love. At this vision, a deep groan broke in sleep from the miserable Victoria. She endeavoured to turn her eyes from them, but could not, and while the most horrible and raging pain shot through her heart, they suddenly disappeared from before her. And she found herself alone in a remote part of the garden. Presently she beheld approaching towards her a group of shadowy figures. They appeared to hover in mid-air, but at no great distance from the earth, and as they came nearer, she discerned that, though of a deadly paleness, their features were beautiful and serene. These passed gradually, when as if from the midst of them, she beheld advancing a Moor of a noble and majestic form. He was clad in a habit of white and gold. On his head he wore a white turban which sparkled with emeralds, and was surmounted by a waving feather of green. His arms and legs, which were bare, were encircled with the finest oriental pearl. He wore a collar of gold round his throat, and his ears were decorated with gold rings of an enormous size. Victoria contemplated this figure with an inexplicable awe, and as she gazed, he bent his knee and extended his arms towards her. While in this attitude, her mind filled with terror, she looked upon him with dread, and essaying to fly, she stumbled and awoke. Reflecting on her dream, she could attribute it only to the disturbed state of her mind, and desirous, if possible, to forget for a few moments her pain, she again endeavoured to sleep. Scarcely had thought become again suspended, ere fancy took the lead. She now saw herself in a church brilliantly illuminated. when, horrible to her eyes, approaching the altar near which she stood appeared Leela, led by Henriquez and attired as a bride. In the instant that their hands were about to be joined, the Moor she had beheld in her preceding dream appeared to start between them, and beckoned her towards him. Involuntarily, she drew near him and touched his hand, when Berenza stood at her side and, seizing her arm, endeavoured to pull her away. "Wilt thou be mine?" in a hurried voice whispered the Moor in her ear, "and none shall then oppose thee." But Victoria hesitated and cast her eyes upon Henriquez. The Moor stepped back, and again the hand of Henriquez became joined with Leela's. "Wilt thou be mine?" exclaimed the Moor in a loud voice, "and the marriage shall not be." "Oh, yes, yes," eagerly cried Victoria, overcome by intense horror at the thoughts of their union. In an instant she occupied the place of Leela, and Leela, no longer the blooming maid but a pallid spectre, fled shrieking through the aisles of the church, while Berenza, suddenly wounded by an invisible hand, sunk covered with blood at the foot of the altar. Exultation filled the bosom of Victoria. She attempted to take the hand of Henriquez, but casting her eyes upon him, she beheld him changed to a frightful skeleton, and in terror awoke. Her mind was now in a chaos of agitation and horror, from which she found it difficult to recover. Endeavouring, however, by a violent effort to recall her scattered ideas and to resume her usual firmness, she became collected enough to review the leading features of her dream. The image which, upon this review, presented itself most forcibly to her mental vision was that of the Moor, whose person she had a confused idea of having seen frequently before. After a moment's reflection, she identified him for Zofloya, the servant of Henriquez. Why he should be connected with her dreams, who never entered her mind when waking, she could not divine. But certain it was that his exact resemblance, though as it were of polished and superior appearance, had figured chiefly in her troubled sight. She next reverted to the terrible moment in which she beheld joined the hands of Leela and Henriquez, but that Zofloya had offered to prevent the marriage. On this incident she pondered with a sensation of pleasure, and Berenza, bleeding and dying at her feet, she contemplated as a blissful omen of her success. The more she considered, the more she inferred, the less reason she perceived for interpreting ill the visions of the night, and the conclusion which at length she drew was this: that every barrier to the gratification of her wishes would ultimately be destroyed, and that she should at length obtain Henriquez. All else she considered as irrelevant to the true purpose of her dream, and the fantastic ebullitions of a disturbed mind. The frequent introduction of Zofloya she judged to be merely in consequence of her beholding him daily, sometimes attending behind the chair of his master at meals, and on other occasions. While Henriquez, changing to a skeleton when she obtained his hand, was emblematic only, she conceived, that he would be hers till death. The following day, when at a late hour she entered the apartment where they usually dined, the first object that caught her attention was the tall, commanding figure of the Moor, standing near the chair of his master. She almost started as she beheld him, and the image in her dreams flashing upon her mind, she marked how exact was the similitude in form, in features, and in dress. She seated herself, however, at the table, but involuntarily stole frequent glances towards him. Once or twice she imagined that he looked upon her with a peculiar expression of countenance, and strange, incongruous ideas shot through her brain, ideas which, even to herself, were indefinable. So some great dream sequences there. Now, one thing probably to mention that's not necessarily about the things I'm going to be saying about dreams more generally, but a number of critics, and I think I'm not wrong in saying that the person who wrote the introduction to this book, who is, let me just check for us, why does it not say, Kimi and Mikasu, who is a great critic, and I've read quite a lot of their work, but still can't say their name, has suggested, and I think it's in this introduction, but certainly not an uncommon idea in criticism, that the sort of actual target of Victoria's desire is this Moorish figure Zofloya, and that's an extra element of transgression in the text for an early 1800s text. What makes this dream demonic? Well, first of all, we're told it's demonic at the end by the devil himself. He says, it was I who appeared to you in the dream in the shape of the Moor Zofloya. certainly this dream sets Victoria up for a fall. It appears as a dream of temptation, primarily. She's offered this pathway to getting everything that she wants, or so it seems. And within very little time, you see this scene where she makes contact with Zofloya, Zofloya makes contact with her, and they start to arrange the death of Berenza. So it sort of starts the ball rolling on that whole sequence of events. And so you can see the dream there as a demonic tool to lead Victoria into sin. In terms as well, perhaps, of this depiction of the Moor as a character who is certainly appealing in a number of different ways, you can arguably say that what becomes later a very clear obsession with him, and quite often an erotically charged obsession with him, really begins to take shape in this dream. So the dream again becomes the seed of something that appears later. What's also quite interesting about this dream is it foretells the future. Now, there's a whole big theological debate, which I'll get into on Saturday, about to what extent the devil can foretell the future. This seems to be within the realm of a quite middle-of-the-road conception, the usual conception, I would say, of the theological position that the devil can see some of the future. But this idea that the devil sees the future, which is easily predictable based on current incidents, happenings, and information available. So it's not the foresight and the omniscience of the divine. And you can say in this dream, there is a prediction made in accordance with Victoria's own personality, but also the dream itself becomes part of that journey. It becomes the trigger for everything that then later happens. You also have in the dream quite clearly a warning about what will happen to Henriques, which is, spoiler alert, death. And not in his old age either. So what you have occurring in this dream, and there's a really interesting theological debate to be had here about why God is allowing demonic dreams. But you have here this sort of setup of a temptation with a warning. So that this isn't a blind falling into sin. And just a couple of pages earlier, it talks about Zofloya's mother who was sort of forced into sin, seduced into sin. It's making quite clear here that Victoria is making those choices for herself. She's been given the set of conditions necessary to get what she wants, i.e. making a pact with Zofloya or the devil. But she's been warned that what that will result in is the death of 3 people, one of whom is the one that she loves, but she chooses to reinterpret that according to her own understanding, her own desires for the situation. And she ignores the warning. So she steps very knowingly into her future, very knowingly into the path of sin. And there's this emphasis in this text, which you don't necessarily see, for example, in texts like The Monk by Matthew Lewis, on the element of free will in terms of Victoria's fall here. So I hope I haven't over-theologized you. I'm going to expand on a lot of this stuff on Saturday in terms of demonic dreams and the theology of dreams. But hopefully it's been a little bit interesting, a little bit of a bite-sized teaser there for some of the things I'm going to be discussing. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow when we're going to be reading another short story. Goodbye. Night, ghouls.